What is the greatest rags to riches story? Someone coming from absolutely nothing, no money, no connections, and becoming super wealthy. Before we start, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos. I wish you a pleasant viewing experience. Story 1. Tao Huabi was the 8th daughter born to a poor family in rural post-war China who was never taught to read or write. As a teenager, she survived the worst famine in human history, partially by foraging for wild plants. After the passing of her husband some years later, she opened a small food stall to support her children. It was at this stall that she first started selling noodles with her homemade chili crisp sauce. By 1989, she was able to open up a restaurant where she quickly earned the nickname Ganma, or Godmother, as she was known to frequently give discounts and extra food to impoverished schoolchildren. Her spicy noodles rapidly grew in popularity, and before long, people were coming just to buy the chili crisp on its own. When construction of a new highway started in the early 90s, she began giving out samples to truckers to promote it by word of mouth, which further boosted its popularity. By 1997, she established her own factory to mass-produce the condiment. Fast forward to today, the Lao Ganma, Old Godmother, brand produces 3 million bottles of chili crisp per day, and is sold in 30 countries alongside numerous knockoff imitations. As for Tao Huabi, whose face adorns every bottle, she's currently estimated to be worth $5 billion and serves on China's national legislature. Answer: similar story in the US that I've heard. There's a brand of tortillas called La Banderita. Story I heard was that a Mexican woman and her husband lived in the US. He worked as a laborer. When Atlanta hosted the Olympics in the 90s, they decided to move there because they figured he'd be able to find more work. She started making tortillas at home for him to take with him. Word spread within the community about how good her tortillas were, and soon people were coming to buy them. So she set up a little production facility. Then the local grocery store called her up, and soon she was selling them to everyone. Now, La Banderita tortillas are sold in pretty much every grocery store in America. They're one of the biggest household names for tortillas, and the same woman still owns the company. Story 2. Sarah Breedlove, born in 1867 in Louisiana. Her parents and all her older siblings were born into slavery. Orphaned at age 7, employed as a child domestic servant by age 12. To earn extra money, she began selling hair products geared toward black women. Eventually developed her own line of hair care products that were sold door to door and demonstrated to groups of women decades before the Avon Lady marketing model was developed from her model. When she retired, she had a sales staff of 20, her own factory in Indianapolis, and her Madam C.J. Walker hair products were sold nationwide and throughout the Caribbean. First African-American woman millionaire, creating an estate that in today's money would be worth over $30 million. Answer: that 30 million figure felt low to me, so I did a little Googling. According to her wiki, she was estimated to be worth between 500 and 100 at the time of her passing in 1919. The CPI inflation calculator puts that at around 10 to 20 billion, which feels much more accurate for her career, though I don't know exactly how much of that would be considered her estate. Story 3. Stephen King dad left his mother when he was 2. She worked a series of odd jobs to provide for him and his brother. He worked various odd jobs to pay his way through college, published short stories here and there, lived in a trailer with his wife and kids, and had just got his phone disconnected because they couldn't afford it when he got the news that his first novel was being published. Received the good news via telegram. Now he's one of, if not the, most popular author in the world. Answer: he worked summers and for a year after college, when he couldn't find a teaching job, at an industrial laundry. When he described it in On Writing, it sounded absolutely ghastly, wrangling loads of linens from restaurants and hospitals into industrial washers. It was such sweaty work, bosses handed out salt pills in the afternoons, and the linens themselves were often crawling with maggots. Even after he found a teaching job, he still worked at the laundry during summers, and all the while his wife worked the overnight shift at Dunkin' Donuts. Then his agent called to say the paperback rights to Carrie sold for $400K, half of which went to Stephen. Sometimes good things do happen to good people. Story 4. Robert Smalls, born a slave, stole a Confederate Navy ship and sailed to freedom. Fought against the Confederacy, and after the war became a congressman from South Carolina and a successful businessman. Bought his former owner's mansion from the U.S. government after they repossessed it. Story 5. Roman Emperor Diocletian came from a poor family, possibly former slaves in Illyria, rose through the military ranks, eventually coming on top after 4 emperors were taken down by his own troops in quick succession. Diocletian ruled for 20 years and actually retired. The empire immediately went into civil war, but he lived the rest of his life peacefully. Zhu Yunzhang was emperor of China and founder of the Ming dynasty. He was an orphan during the chaotic collapse of the Yuan dynasty, begging for alms. He eventually joined a rebel group, rose to leadership, conquered Nanjing, and came out on top of the power struggle. Answer: at Carnuntum, people begged Diocletian to return to the throne, to resolve the conflicts that had arisen through Constantine's rise to power and Maxentius's usurpation. Diocletian's reply: if you could show the cabbage that I planted with my own hands to your emperor, he definitely wouldn't dare suggest that I replace the peace and happiness of this place with the storms of a never-satisfied greed. Story 6. Of the ones I've heard of, probably John Paul DeJoria. Poor as Fudge founded Paul Mitchell Hair Products and then bought the Patron tequila brand when it was tiny. 2 total unrelated bangers, both worth billions. Story 7. Founder of Ming Dynasty, Zhu Yunzhang. He was known as the Beggar Emperor. His parents and siblings died in a famine. He was then accepted into a temple where he begged for alms as a monk and learnt to read and write. Traveling as a monk made it clear to him what was wrong with the country. He subsequently joined a rebellion, worked his way to the top, and united the whole of China, founding Ming Dynasty. Story 8. Ray Charles. Mother washed clothes, brother drowned, he went blind, got PTSD, and became Ray Fudge Charles. Story 9. The BBC has a podcast called Good Bad Billionaire. They talk about how billionaires grew up, earned their first million, then billion, and then they discuss their philanthropy or misdeeds. It's a really interesting and casual listen. Highly recommend. Story 10. Lonnie Johnson, inventor of the Super Soaker water gun. Maybe not the greatest rags to riches story, but this guy is impressive nevertheless. The greatest would have to be John D. Rockefeller. Story 11. Stallone. He was so desperate for parts, he had a minor role in adult content. At his brokest, he sold his dog, his best friend, for $25. Spent his last bucks to watch a boxing match and got inspired to write Rocky. Studios loved it, and IRC offered him something like $250K for the script, as long as he didn't star in it. But he rejected their offer. He believed in himself, and eventually the studio gave him a lowball figure and let him star in it. Story 12. Giannis Antetokounmpo has a unique story. Child of refugees, born and raised in Greece, but the government refused to acknowledge him and give him his passport. Took years fighting against a racist government. His parents were poor. There were days they did not have food. He and his brothers had to share basketball shoes to practice. They were all selling stuff on streetlights as teenagers. His coach and teammates on an amateur team helped him a lot when he was a teenager. They gave them shoes and food. Then he got drafted on the NBA. Answer: there is an anecdote about him making it to the NBA and getting his first game check debuting against the Knicks in NYC. He wanted to send it home to help his family because it was a lot of money. After making the wire transfer, he realized he sent all of his money and had to run back down the streets of NYC before playing his first game. Someone somehow recognized him and gave him a ride to MSG. The rest is history. Story 13. Qing Shi was a female Chinese pirate in the 18th, 19th centuries whose life reads like a bonkers romance novel. She was born poor and ended up working a brothel where she caught the eye of a pirate captain who, according to lore, attacked the brothel specifically to liberate her. They married and she sailed by his side for years until his passing. At that point, she managed to gain control of his modest pirate alliance and proceeded to kick all the jerk. She built up one of the largest pirate fleets ever, with hundreds of ships and thousands of sailors. One so large that it was able to fight the Imperial Chinese Navy to a standstill. Ultimately, the Chinese government had to offer pardons to her and the vast majority of her crews for them to agree to stand down. They even got to keep their loot. And then she retired to run a casino brothel and live off her accumulated booty, dying sometime in her late 60s. To this day, she's widely considered the most successful pirate in history. Answer: it's better than that. The pirate fleet under Qing Shi was so large and controlled so many waterways that they charged taxes to companies and issued passports. They had to issue receipts and keep meticulous records of who had paid taxes to them in order to tell who was and wasn't allowed to sail the waterways they controlled. I have heard conflicting stories on if she charged small-time fishermen. There is a saying that the only reason Imperial China was able to get as big as it did and control as much territory as it did was because of bureaucracy. Story 14. Andrew Carnegie, immigrant, father's business struggled, got himself a job at the mill when he was 12, wound up one of the richest men in America. Story 15. Martha Stewart grew up dirt poor and her family ate from a backyard garden in Jersey. Became a billionaire. Then got taken down and kept getting back up. Edit, backyard from background. Story 16. Jack Ma. Parents were not wealthy. Mom was a factory worker. Dad was artist. Jack struggled academically and failed his college entrance exams multiple times. He's now one of the richest person and founded Alibaba, one of the most prominent e-commerce and cloud providers. Story 17. Victoria Woodhull got rich as a traveling magnetic healer, joined the spiritual movement and lost all her money, then became a stockbroker on Wall Street and got rich again. She was a leader of the women's suffrage movement, the first woman to own a brokerage firm on Wall Street, and was a United States presidential candidate in 1872. Story 18. Francis Ngannou. Born in extreme poverty in Cameroon, he was homeless, an illegal immigrant, went to jail, took up MMA, and became the UFC world champ. No idea what his net worth is, but he'll have been paid in the multiple millions for boxing Tyson Fury and Anthony Joshua. Story 19. She didn't come from absolute poverty, but Sarah Blakey, the founder of Spanx, essentially spent a decade trying to convince people to believe in her product. When she finally did, Spanx exploded. She refused to take outside investment and built the whole thing on high-risk loans, one single mill owner in North Carolina who agreed to take a chance on her product. At 41, she finally took on investment from a PE firm and became the youngest self-made female billionaire ever. She's celebrated by giving every single one of her employees 10, 0, and 2 free plane tickets anywhere on Earth. Story 20. There's a lot of these. Andrew Carnegie started out as a penniless Scottish immigrant. When he died, he was worth 2 of the U.S. GDP. Story 21. Julio Cesar Chavez Sr., widely believed to be the greatest Mexican boxer of all time and recognized among the greatest boxers in the history period, grew up in an abandoned train cart along with 9 of his siblings. He started boxing at age 16, fought relentlessly for the first few years of his pro career, and eventually became recognized for his exciting, pressure-heavy style. Once he started getting on primetime TV, his fights became cultural events in Mexico. This allowed him to set his family up with generational wealth. I've read some estimates say that he's worth around 10 million USD nowadays. Story 22. David Trine, the guy who started Hui Fong Food, the maker of sriracha sauce, has a pretty inspiring story. Story 23. Recently, I'd say Gordon Ramsay. Born in Scotland to a nurse and an alcoholic father, he went from basically homeless to what he is now. Story 24. I don't know about super wealthy, but I knew a guy who decided to turn his life around, got out of jail, bought a ladder and some tools, and did handyman work mostly fixing people's air conditioners. He got good at it, enough that he and fiancée started an air conditioning repair installation company. Got to the point where they were one of the biggest companies of that kind in the city by the time they retired. Normally I shoot talk rags to riches stories because there's always a part of the story where some unfair advantage got glossed over. For them, it's that they became friends with the owner of their biggest competitor and bought him out when he decided to go on some religious pilgrimage. Everything before that was just hard work, hiring good people, and getting the most out of their employees by treating them fairly and paying them well. Story 25. Timothy Dexter. Born to poor parents in colonial USA, he married a rich widow. Dexter gained notoriety for his peculiar business ventures, often initiated based on bad advice or seemingly random ideas. He shipped coal to Newcastle during a miners' strike, which resulted in a profitable sale. He shipped warming pans to the West Indies, which were then used for scooping molasses. He shipped wool mittens to Siberia and whalebone to the South Sea Islands. And it all started after marrying a rich widow with buying up continental currency, which later became valuable. He bought it for 1 cent on the dollar, shipped it to Massachusetts, and sold it for par. Then he wrote a book, A Pickle for the Knowing Ones, and said that he was the world's greatest philosopher. Story 26. Sidney James Weinberg, October 12, 1891, July 23, 1969, was a longtime leader of the Wall Street firm Goldman Sachs, nicknamed Mr. Wall Street by the New York Times and Director's Director by Fortune magazine. In a rags to riches story, he rose from a janitor's assistant, making 3 weeks to CEO. Story 27. In the dusty rural stretches of Fitchett Province, Thailand, sometime around 1923, a boy named Chaleo was born into a family of Chinese immigrants who scraped by selling ducks and fruit. Chaleo's childhood was defined by hardship. He grew up in a small wooden house, and the idea of finishing school was a luxury far beyond his family means. By the time he was a teenager, Chaleo was already helping his parents, hustling to earn every single baht. But there was a quiet spark in him, a determination to build something of his own. In the 1950s, he packed his few belongings and traveled to Bangkok, a city buzzing with opportunity and possibility. He took any work he could find and soon discovered a niche in selling antibiotics. Chaleo learned the ropes of the pharmaceutical world not from textbooks, but from sheer experience, memorizing what customers needed, who his suppliers were, and how to move boxes of medicine across a chaotic city. By 1962, he'd scraped together enough money to open his own company, TC Pharmaceutical. It was a modest operation at first, producing antibiotics and basic medicines. But as the years passed, Chaleo noticed something about the men who bought his wares. Thailand's laborers and truck drivers worked punishing hours, and what they craved more than anything was a pick-me-up that would keep them going. Inspired by popular Japanese tonics like Lipovitan D, he began experimenting with a syrupy, caffeine-charged drink of his own. In 1976, Chaleo launched Krating Ding, or Red Bull in Thai. Sold in squat brown bottles for a few baht each, it quickly became the secret weapon of Thailand's working class. Factory workers, farmers, and taxi drivers would down it before long shifts, swearing by its jolt of energy. Chaleo's drink wasn't fancy, but it was exactly what people needed, and that made all the difference. Thousands of miles away, Dietrich Mateschitz, an Austrian marketing executive, stepped off a plane in Bangkok in the early 1980s. He was jet-lagged and exhausted. A local contact handed him a bottle of Krating Ding, promising it would perk him up. Mateschitz gulped it down and felt instantly revived, and he had a vision. What if he could bring this miracle tonic to the rest of the world? When the two men finally sat down to talk, they couldn't have been more different. Chaleo was a self-made entrepreneur from the back streets of Thailand. Mateschitz was a polished European businessman who knew how to sell dreams, but they shared an instinct for opportunity. In 1984, they shook hands on a new venture. They would create Red Bull GmbH. Chaleo and his son Chalerm would own 51%. Mateschitz would hold 49%. Together, they spent 3 years reworking the formula, toning down the sweetness, adding carbonation, and developing a sleek, modern look in slim silver and blue cans. When Red Bull launched in Austria in 1987, it was an immediate sensation. It wasn't just a drink. It was a symbol of energy, rebellion, and living life to the limit. Red Bull's success snowballed, reaching every corner of the world. It made billionaires of both partners, but Chaleo never changed. While the brand became synonymous with skydiving stunts, F1 racing, and extreme sports, Chaleo himself stayed out of the spotlight. He was a man who preferred his quiet routines, time with family, managing his growing business interests, and never straying far from his humble beginnings. Chaleo Uvidye passed away in March 2012 in Bangkok, leaving behind a vast fortune. His family, led by his son Chalerm, continues to hold a controlling stake in Red Bull, quietly stewarding the empire he built from a simple idea brewed in the heart of Thailand. Red Bull current valuation, 22B. Österturm, story 28. Oprah would fit the bill. Grew up poor, was abused by her family, ran away at 13, got a college scholarship as a reward for winning a beauty pageant, went on to be a TV correspondent at 19, first African-American to do it in Tennessee, and later the first woman to own and produce their own show. Story 29. Sam Murray, famously known as the Banana King. He embodies one of the most compelling rags-to-riches stories in American history. He immigrated to the United States from the Russian Empire with nothing, barely speaking English, and began his career in the fruit trade by buying overripe bananas that major companies discarded. While others saw waste, Murray saw opportunity. He sold these bananas cheaply to underserved markets, turning a meager investment into steady profit. His success was built not on privilege or luck, but on grit, hustle, and an uncanny ability to spot value where others didn't. Murray didn't stop at selling bananas. She built an empire. After founding his own company, Cuyamel Fruit, he expanded aggressively through the jungles of Central America, building railroads, ports, and even influencing local politics to protect his business interests. His hands-on leadership and relentless ambition eventually led to a corporate showdown with United Fruit Company, the industry giant. Against all odds, Murray outmaneuvered them, merged the two companies, and took control, transforming from an outsider to the most powerful man in the global fruit trade. What truly sets Zamuri apart is the audacity of his tactics. When the Honduran government threatened his business interests, Zamuri didn't lobby or negotiate. He hired mercenaries, staged a coup, and installed a puppet president more favorable to American fruit interests. This direct intervention in foreign governance blurred the lines between entrepreneur and warlord. His influence extended far beyond the marketplace and into the geopolitical fabric of Central America, making him a key figure in what would later be called banana republics. Perhaps most incredible is how Zamuri eventually took control of United Fruit itself, one of the most powerful corporations in the world, by ousting the very men who once mocked him. Among them was J.P. Morgan's hand-picked board, whom Zamuri considered out-of-touch elites. While Morgan saw United Fruit as a paper asset, Zamuri understood it as a living, breathing operation. He stormed the boardroom, forced the old guard out, and took over the company he once competed against. In doing so, he didn't just build an empire, he conquered one. Source: one of my favorite books, The Fish That Ate the Whale, The Life and Times of America's Banana King. Story 30. Say what you want about Eminem, but he's the definition of a rags to riches story. Dude grew up in a broken home, dirt poor in Detroit, bounced between crappy neighborhoods and schools, got jumped, bullied, barely made it through high school. He worked dead-end jobs and lived in trailers trying to support his kid before anyone gave him a second look. And it's not like the rap world was rolling out the red carpet for some white guy. He had to fight to be taken seriously in a genre that didn't want him at first. But his skill was undeniable. His wordplay, flow, intensity. He didn't just break into the industry, he kicked the darn door down. Went from freestyling at open mics to Dr. Dre hearing one of his tapes and signing him almost overnight. Now the guy's sold hundreds of millions of records, won more awards than he can carry, and sits at the top of a genre he was never supposed to belong to. From food stamps to Forbes lists, if that's not the ultimate rags to riches art, I don't know what is. Story 31. Johann Jacob Astor, first multimillionaire in the USA. When he died in 1848, he had a fortune at over 30 million, which was worth almost 1 trillion in today's money. Story 32. Chris Gardner, 100. The dude literally went from sleeping in subway station bathrooms with his son to becoming a millionaire stockbroker. No money, no connections, just raw hustle. That movie, The Pursuit of Happiness, that's his real life. Answer: before he was homeless, he was working as a medical supplies salesman. His turning point in his life was when he was leaving a hospital after a non-productive sales visit. He noticed a red Ferrari circling the parking lot, looking in vain for a vacant parking spot. Chris waved the guy over, indicating he was about to leave the parking lot and the guy could have his spot. But before he got in his car to leave, he asked the driver of the red car, "What do you do and how do you do it?" The guy was a stockbroker who earned $90,000 a month. Chris was earning only $13,000 a year as a medical supplies salesman. But in the movie, this chance meeting is turned into one of the most typical Hollywood movie cliches. Chris is in the middle of a busy city, standing on a sidewalk directly outside the front entrance of a stock brokerage, when a red sports car drives up and just happens to snag the only available parking space outside his place of business, conveniently right in front of the entrance to the building. Story 33. Arnold Schwarzenegger came from rural Austria to become the greatest bodybuilder, the highest paid Hollywood actor, and later the governor of the America's richest state. Story 34. Confucius. Born into poverty and effectively became the head of a nation. Born the son of a concubine and was considered basically trash by his birthright. He was born into abject poverty, often starving, and on the brink of passing. He was also incredibly ugly. So ugly that it was often commented how hard he was to look at or be around. People supposedly beat him when he was a child because they thought he was so ugly that he deserved it. And yet he was so intelligent and so persistent that he eventually rose up the entire hierarchy of his nation and died with about as much power as an emperor. At one point, he was both the Chief Minister of Justice and acting Prime Minister. Story 35. Trent Reznor of 9 Inch Nails. Dude was a janitor at a recording studio in the late 80s. The owner let him use the equipment after hours where he recorded Pretty Dislike Machine. The album is now certified triple platinum, and 9 Inch Nails is often regarded as one of the most influential artists of all time. Story 36. Madonna didn't graduate college, came to NYC with 35 and nothing else, was violation not long after arriving, etc., etc. Story 37. Napoleon, even though it's so obvious it might be cheating. Lenin was a newsy and debate club kid, but came from probably relatively greater means than Napoleon. Xi lived in a cave and was a school teacher. Story 38. I don't know about greatest, but Lyndon Johnson is one of the most interesting. He grew up in the poor Texas Hill Country. His father lost everything on a few bad harvests. And through a combination of hard work, vision, and a unique gift to read people, he went all the way to the White House. Story 39. I may be biased, but I have to throw my boss in the mix. Born in Cambodia and tossed into the concentration camps of the Khmer Rouge, survived polio but lost a leg. Moved to the U.S. when he was 7, started 3 bar restaurants that are still thriving, and created Screwball Whiskey. He founded an orphanage that he regularly checks in on back in Cambodia and gives so much to our community constantly. Think what you want about the peanut butter whiskey, but that man deserves a mention here. Story 40. Jack Dempsey. He was a homeless dude riding the rails that fought for food money, becomes heavyweight champ in the biggest sportocon at the time. Story 41. Biddy Mason was a slave sold as a baby to a Mormon who eventually brought her to California where technically slavery was not allowed. Eventually won her freedom and worked as a midwife. Invested her wages in buying a home and land in Los Angeles before it was the city it is now. Bought the land cheap, sold when prices went up, invested that money in rooming houses and commercial properties, which brought in more money, and she reinvested. When she died, she was one of the city's wealthiest, having risen to the level of a real estate tycoon worth multiple millions when accounting for inflation. Of course, buried in an unmarked grave in Boyle Heights, but now marked and recognized. Story 42. J.K. Rowling went from a mother surviving on state handouts to a billionaire after several publishers turned her down. Story 43. What about that South African guy who started from almost nothing, just his dad's emerald mine, and now is the richest man in the world and adored by millions for his Nazi salutes, but is unable to duck a left hook? I can remember his name, but he comes to mind as I sit on the shitter with explosive diarrhea. These facts may be related. Story 44. Jesus. He was born no fishes. He was in his 30s, invest 1 fish, turned into many fishes, got takedown, moved in with his dad, now infinite fishes. Story 45. I forget his name, but look up the story of the guy who created Piggly Wiggly, the store. Dude made and lost like 4 fortunes in his life. He went from rags to riches on repeat. Story 46. Shahid Khan is a good one. Came to the U.S. with 500 at 16 years old. First job was washing dishes for $120 a.m. hour. Now is worth 13B. Story 47. Masayoshi Son, rags to riches as Korean living in Japan, became a billionaire, lost it all, then did it again, if you believe it all. Story 48. I was born a poor black child, Adikyo YK. In reality, I would say jewel culture. Grew up in Alaska homesteading. Pure survival existence. Story 49. Margaret Olivia Slocum Sage was a school teacher and married into wealth. Her misogynistic husband died and left her with millions that she used to fund female colleges and feminist causes. Story 50. Andrew Carnegie, an immigrant from Scotland, started shoveling coal, grew up in poverty, became wealthy selling stocks, started a steel company, became the world's first billionaire. Story 51. My aunt had a very frank realization of her degree of talents and the opportunities available to her in the area and era in which she lived. So she laser focused on shooting the moon and marrying rich. Found a successful real estate guy through the golf club she part-timed at and succeeded. Worked out well for my parents and the rest her siblings, because then she could buy the good cocaine for parties. Gotta give it to her. She looked at the options available to her and bent the challenge. Respect. Story 52. Loretta Lynn, the country singer. She grew up literally a coal miner's daughter. The movie featuring Sissy Spacek is an amazing film to watch. Lynn chose Spacek to portray her and had to talk her into it. Spacek sang every single note in the film, personally trained and guided by Lynn. Born to a poor family in Kentucky and a married mother of 3 by the time she was 19, Loretta Lynn became one of the most legendary country music performers of all time. She had a net worth of more than $60 million when she passed away in 2022 at age 90 after battling addiction and health issues for much of her life. She was Crystal Gale's sister, in fact, and had 6 of her own children. Story 53. Not the greatest worldwide, probably, but for me, personally, my maternal grandfather came from nothing. Famine in the village, not enough to eat twice. He struggled heavily, learned heavily. In the army, he was top of his class. Internationally, on a U.S. mission to Haiti, he solved a conflict between our army and another country's army. Multimillionaire now, which is very hard to do with Pakistan's economy, built an empire for all of us, continues to take care of everyone. In my eyes, he is the greatest man to ever have lived. Story 54. Robert Smalls went from enslaved on a plantation to stealing a Confederate ship, sailing to freedom, becoming a celebrity, running for state representative, to buying his former slave owner's plantation and letting the slave owner's widow stay on the property as a tenant. There is finally a movie in the works about his story. Story 55. Emmanuel Jal, born into war and genocide turned war child, now a rather wealthy musician that gives most of his money to charity to help children in developing countries. He made a movie about going back to the village he grew up in. It's not an easy movie to watch, but an incredible story about overcoming dislike. He also did a TED Talk about the aid worker who lost her life-saving children like him, including him personally. Story 56. Keith Gill turned $50K into over $1 billion and counting, investing into GameStop edit, word and adding. I'll be banned for this comment probably. Story 57. Genghis Khan, born between 1155 and 1167 and given the name Temujin, he was the eldest child of Yesugei, a Mongol chieftain of the Borjigin clan, and his wife Hayon. When Temujin was 8, his father died and his family was abandoned by its tribe. Reduced to near poverty, Temujin eliminated his older half-brother to secure his familial position. Story 58. Pretty much any athlete who grew up poor and became world-class in a popular sport, football, soccer for the Yanks, is full of stories like that about very poor children making it into the top leagues and retiring dirty rich. To name an example, Maradona grew up in a slum playing ball. His parents had to go hungry so they could afford to feed him. He went on to become the greatest player in the world and left an inheritance worth $150 million. Story 59. Oprah Gail Winfrey was born poor in rural Mississippi to a soldier and an unwed teenage mother. Her grandmother raised her until she was 6. Then her mother found work, so she was sent to Milwaukee to live with her. While mother was away in their inner city apartment, little Oprah was repeatedly intimacy abused for years. She tried running away from that nightmare, was sent to a detention home, only to be turned back when all the beds were full. Homeless at 13 to 14, she got pregnant. Her baby died very young. She then found her father and went to stay with him. She's described him as very strict, but by 17, she had turned her life around. Story 60. Cristiano Ronaldo, born to a lower middle-class family with multiple children in Madeira, Portugal, swept streets to earn a living to support the family and only relied on his passion for football to take him ahead. Left his family at 14 to join a team far from home and rose through with discipline and dedication to master his craft. Got noticed by a legendary manager and was one of the youngest, most expensive transfer in EPL history to be adorned with the number 7. Despite fame and money, his work ethic didn't change. His discipline brought him many accolades all across Europe, and in turn being the highest paid transfer at the time. Over time became one of the leading goal scorers of the game and is the most influential athlete all over social media. His celebrations are mirrored by athletes of all sports, and his ability to win trophies, even at the age of 39, show his hunger. He's worth $1 billion and has an airport named after him, museums, stadiums, and despite all this, he has still been kind enough to help out people wherever, whenever he can. Truly, from sweeping for rags to sweeping the streets with his unknown number of cars in his collections. Story 61. Desi Arnaz is a pretty good example. He came from a well-to-do family but fled Cuba and lost everything by the time he got to America. He changed television forever and ran the biggest studio at its time. Story 62. Friend I grew up with, he grew up poor but a very talented artist. Rich and famous now, very happy for them. Answer. Friend of mine grew up in a cult, escaped at 16 with no qualifications, became a shelf stacker working nights for nearly 30 years, was mid-40s, still only just able to rent a room in a student house. Got in very early on Bitcoin. Now he has 400 million, but he has his own house and won't be on the streets when he hits his late 60s or whatever. Lovely man, and now he is pursuing all the education he was kept from, and then couldn't afford, as well as all his interests and charities, and just the normal stuff like going out with friends that he never had time or money to do, or getting a driving license, that kind of thing. Even bought his parents a house, although he doesn't speak to them. It's great to see. Story 63. Babe Ruth is an interesting one. Born in 1895 in one of the poorest neighborhoods of Baltimore, Maryland, grew up in his dad's saloon stealing adult beverage and getting into constant trouble on the streets. His parents sent him to a Catholic boarding school at age 7 due to his extreme misbehavior. Then one of the teachers at the school taught him how to play baseball, and the rest is history. He went on to become arguably the greatest baseball player of all time, was one of the most famous people in America during the Roaring Twenties, and was essentially the first professional athlete to become a full-blown pop culture celebrity. Story 64. Guy in Texas, 1940s. Dad kicks him out of the house. Mom gives him 20. Various businesses. Ends up potato farming. Business deal with McDonald's. Dies a billionaire. Story 65. Arnold Schwarzenegger. Ulysses S. Grant also comes to mind for me. The man was so poor at one point in his life, he was pawning his possessions to buy his children's Xmas presents. Story 66. Andrew Carnegie came here as an immigrant as a boy. He and his family had nothing, and the rest is history. Story 67. The Sylvester Stallone story comes close, although he wasn't as desolate as some other people in this thread. He was a B actor barely getting by, and wrote the script for Rocky in 3 days. It was inspired by Chuck Wepner's fight with Muhammad Ali. He held out to someone who would let star in the film, even though he would have made so much more if he sold it outright. As they say, the rest is history. I am inspired by him and his journey. Story 68. Charlie Chaplin, maybe, grew up in poverty in Victorian London and went on to become the big movie star in the world. I'm not even sure modern audiences can comprehend how famous he was at his peak. Story 69. Louis Armstrong is believed to have been born in New Orleans on August 4, 1901, but the date has been heavily debated. Armstrong himself often claimed he was born on July 4, 1900. His parents were Mary Estelle, Mayan Albert, and William Armstrong. Mary Albert was from Buda, Louisiana, and gave birth at home when she was about 16. Less than a year and a half later, they had a daughter, Beatrice Mama Lucy Armstrong, 19,031,987, who Albert raised. 9. William Armstrong abandoned the family shortly after that. 10. Louis Armstrong was raised by his grandmother until the age of 5, when he was returned to his mother. 10. Armstrong spent his youth in poverty in a rough neighborhood known as the Battlefield. 11. On the southern section of Rampart Street. At the age of 6, Armstrong started attending the Fisk School for Boys. 13. A school that accepted black children in the racially segregated school system of New Orleans. Armstrong lived with his mother and sister during this time and worked for the Karnofskys. 14. A family of Lithuanian Jews. At their home, Armstrong helped their sons Morris and Alex collect rags and bones and deliver coal. In 1969, while recovering from heart and kidney problems at Beth Israel Hospital in New York City, Armstrong wrote a memoir called Louis Armstrong, The Jewish Family in New Orleans, LA, the year of 1907, describing his time working for the Karnofsky family. 15. Side. Story 70. Roaring Kitty, aka a deep fudge value, turned $50K into hundreds of millions, potentially over $1 billion now, in under 5 years. Fudge Wall Street. Story 71. J.K. Rowling, single mother, living on benefits and social housing, and writing her books in a cafe. Edit. With $1 billion in the bank, she can say whatever she wants, and BTW is entitled to her opinion. Story 72. Hongwu, the first Ming Emperor of China. He was born into a peasant family and then went on to overthrow the Yuan dynasty and found the Ming dynasty. Story 73. For me, Genghis Khan, he wasn't exactly born in rags, being a son of a minor clan chieftain, but he and his family later found themselves expelled from their tribe after their father was taken down. They were in abject poverty and could easily have perished. But a few short decades later, Temujin would have united all Mongol tribes, crushed 2 of the regional superpowers of the age, Chinese and Khwarezmian empires, created the world's largest ever land empire, stretching from Korea to Hungary, and amassed a fortune beyond anyone's imagining. Story 74. W. Clement Stone. He went from being a poor kid in Chicago selling newspapers on the street to creating and owning a multi-billion insurance company. He read and wrote a bunch of positive mental attitude self-help books, developing a system he credited to his great success. He was a major political donor. Mover shaker. He lived in a huge mansion on the shore of Lake Michigan, just a few miles from where I grew up. He lived to be 100 years old. Story 75. Mattress Mac. Dude came to Houston as an immigrant with nothing, barely even owned the clothes on his back. Now he gives away free mattresses to literally everyone who can't afford one. Story 76. Oprah, poor, illegitimate kid born in the Jim Crow South. Unstable home life, abused, intimacy assaulted numerous times by her uncle, has child when she's barely in her teens from the violation, baby dies. Now she's a billionaire and was one of the most important arbiters of taste and culture in the U.S. for many years. Story 77. There's a YouTube video on Wang Chuanfu, founder of the BYD company, maker of electric vehicles. Now that's a rags to riches story. Story 78. Bernie Ecclestone, controversial, yes, fascinating, yes. Grew up in poverty and went on to own Formula One and make it one of the biggest sports in the world. His dealing with business, drivers, and teams is fascinating to read about. Story 79. The founder of Domino's Pizza. Orphan ended up building a Catholic college outside of Naples, Florida, right next to Immokalee, Florida, poorest part of the state. It's going to be swanky college kids connected to understanding poverty. Story 80. Isaac Newton. Man came from nothing and later become the most influential scientist in the UK, became the religious leader of the founding fathers of the US, and created the first secret service on the planet. Story 81. Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev, born into the peasant class in old Russia, when there was a royal family and rose up to run the Soviet Union. Incredible rags to riches and absolute power. Story 82. Lots of sporting legends up there. One that springs to my mind is Duncan Bannatyne. He wasn't so much from absolute poverty, but he was a Scottish man who grew up living in a house that houses multiple families. Joined the Navy, dishonorably discharged, he admits fault, left the Navy with nothing and worked various part-time jobs, bought an ice cream for $450, expanded and bought an empire of ice cream vans, sold the business, built another business, built his own health club brand, became an entrepreneur, and is now a millionaire. He is well known for being a dragon on Dragon's Den, Shark Tank for you international people, but when he finished there, he sold off every investment he made on the show. I think he mostly does charity stuff now. He's made his millions. Story 83. Eminem. Dad left when he was young. Mom was a substances addict. Brother had special needs, and they were constantly moving back and forth between Missouri and Detroit. Story 84. Hiwaran Sordikus Sarawarnarn. Come and listen to a story about a man named Jed, poor mountaineer, barely kept his family fed. Then one day he was shooting at some food, and up through the ground come a bubbling crude, oil that is black gold, Texas tea. Well, the first thing you know, old Jed's a millionaire. Kin folks said, Jed, move away from there. He said, California is the place you ought to be. So he loaded up the truck and they moved to Beverly Hills, that is, swimming pools, movie stars. Story 85. Andrew Carnegie. He was the third son of extremely poor Irish sailors. Never had a good education. Family left Ireland for America during a famine. Fast forward a few years, he became one of the richest steamship owners in the world. Story 86. Amancio Ortega. Started with nothing, founded Inditex, owner of Zara, among many other brands, which became the biggest clothing company in the world. Story 87. Genghis Khan. Yes, his father was a clan chief, but the father died early, and Temujin, Genghis's name before he was Khan, grew up in the wild with his mother, older brother, and a couple other relatives, living off of the odd rodent they could catch. He was once even made a slave, founded the Mongol Empire, which was without a doubt the most powerful polity of the time. Story 88. Percy Master P. Miller, born into nothing, in one of the worst housing projects in the world, has nothing. His grandfather in California dies and leaves him a modest inheritance, so he moves to California and decides to open a record store. Sidebar, kids, a record store is where you had to go to buy music. We didn't used to have every song ever on our phones. As a matter of fact, we didn't used to have phones with us. He shortly realizes that it would be cheaper, easier to fill his store with merchandise if he controlled production instead of being gouged by music distributors. So he decides to make music himself. He finds a few local rappers and producers to assist him and has a measure of success, not just because the music is okay, but because unlike most rappers in history, he figured out the processes behind the music and had direct outlets to sell his own product and keep most of the money. When the major record companies came around to him, he was able to tell them he didn't need them. He was able to sign an unprecedented deal with Priority Records to partner with his label only because they could offer more promotion and distribution coverage than what he had regionally. In need of more talent, he goes back home to New Orleans. Not known to be a major city for rap music at the time, and gets his brothers, cousins, and childhood friends, none of whom were professional musicians, to be acts. No Limit becomes the one independent music label in the world. And because P was fair and did business with his loved ones, he didn't rob his artist's talent like most executives. He not only became independently wealthy, but he created more rich people as well. It didn't stop with music. He branched out into film and clothing as well. Oh yeah, he also made it to play in the NBA. Story 89. I have a name that comes to mind, but I won't say it. It will remain a pickle for the knowing ones. Story 90. I worked with a guy that grew up on the mean streets and worked his way up in a business, then owned his own business within that industry, became fantastically wealthy, blew through money like crazy, including being very generous with employees, lost everything. He had a thing for racehorses, continued to work in the same industry at someone else's business, a friend of his who owned a similar business, and had an incredible life, most down-to-earth person I ever met in our industry, and one of my favorite co-workers ever. This all spanned a period of about 45 to 50 years, and he passed of cancer at age 70 in 2002. Just an incredible person. His greatest earnings era was mid-late 1960s through early mid-1990s. He was the kind of guy that treated everyone as an equal and would tell off-color jokes and stories of growing up on the streets in the 1950s and early 60s. I miss him dearly. When I went to his wake, the line of cars trying to get into the funeral home parking lot stretched around the block and down the street, and once inside, there was not a single bad thing said about this man. He was an absolute treasure, and the industry is notoriously dirty in practice. Story 91. I have a close friend and also one of my cousins who did just that. My friend and I started out the same in high school, and just last week, he told me was on track to make $1 million+ this year. I'm pinching pennies. I know this goes against the Reddit dogma of rich people bad, but there you have it. Story 92. Angelo Solomon. He was born in what is now Nigeria, enslaved by a neighboring tribe and sold to Europeans for a horse. A few decades later, he was head of the servants of one of the richest princely houses in Europe, spoke fluent German, English, Latin, Czech, French, and Italian, was an excellent chess player, married a European woman in one of the most important churches of the Holy Roman Empire, was valued by the emperor as a companion, was the tutor of the crown prince, and was vice master of ceremonies of the Freemasons. Story 93. I think the story of Kurt Cobain and Chris Novoselic is pretty rad. Came from a small logging town with no future, except for they were really good at making songs. Story 94. Queen Mary of Denmark. Aussie girl became a queen after meeting a future king in a Sydney pub during the 2000 Olympics. Story 95. I think a more common people one is about a group of guys who recorded a show in one's home, eventually got popular and started a media company. After lots of internal issues, selling it and seeing it close, have made the announcement it's coming back. I'm aware my timetable is off. I have been out of the fandom for a while. Story 96. Amazon started in a garage and look how big it is now. If that's not a rags to riches story, then I don't know what else is. Story 97. The director of my company grew up sleeping under bridges and spending his days picking up cigarette butts for his mentally unwell mother. Put himself through engineering school, worked his way up from construction supervisor to project manager, got an offer to start up a new division within a large company, grew that division into a powerhouse, and now is off to Texas as a full partner to start a new division down there. He is rich and successful beyond his wildest dreams. Story 98. Notch. I know he's a bit of a male body part, but still, he came from a family of divorce and substances. His sister died from substances. His father committed tragic end. He lived in his mother's basement and was essentially the typical Discord mod. He worked crappy jobs but made his own game in his mother's basement. This game, of course, went on to become Minecraft. Now he's a billionaire and still miserable. Story 99. Francis Ngannou, the dude who fought in UFC and later Tyson Fury and Anthony Joshua. If I'm not mistaken, he tried to cross borders by foot multiple times to get out of his country only to get shipped back and have to do it all over again. That's like next fudge level determination. Story 100. Francis Ngannou's story is incredible. From the salt mines in Cameroon to international stardom, you can find pictures of him with his mom in his old home. Story 101. Not super wealthy, but my dad had a good story. Over 40 years old, fresh out of prison, on substances, he was a Marine and biker gang type of guy. So definitely rough around the edges, to say the least. He moved to another state, left us, but I'm not mad at it, is what it is. Got clean, started painting cars, eventually bought a little auto body shop, grew it over time, I started visiting him in the summers, working at his shop when I was around 10. He says shop became very successful. He ran it hard, demanded perfection. His best years, he was making well over $300K a year, eventually sold the shop for a couple million and retired. Even though he did sacrifice being a father, which was a shoot move, but it's life, man. I just thought it was kind of cool going from 40 in prison and on substances to a multimillionaire eventually. Story 102. He's very well known in the film industry for helping out budding directors. He sells the rights to his short stories for one. I have an ex-coworker who directed a Stephen King movie when he was in his early 20s. Story 103. In terms of athletes, Kurt Warner's story has to be near the top. Married, living with his in-laws, stocking shelves at the supermarket, trying to catch on with a team. Then a few years later, he goes from a backup to NFL MVP, Super Bowl MVP in the same year. Story 104. Floyd Mayweather Jr. His dad used him as a human shield in a gunfight when he was a baby. He grew up in one of the most poverty-stricken areas of Michigan. If you look at where he came from and what he achieved, it's what movies are made out of. Story 105. Not sure that reaches the extent that a lot of other comments do, but I want to share the story of two athletes that I really admire, the F1 driver Esteban Ocon and the footballer Pell. Ocon is from a working-class family in Normandy, France. His father, Laurent, was his mechanic and would build cars for him at a time when a lot of wealthier kids in the sport would buy cars from external companies. When he grew more competitive in the sport, his parents sold their house and moved into a caravan, traveling all around Europe to support their son's dream. Esteban almost quit to become a McDonald's worker, but thankfully stuck with what he loved. He was sidelined by Lawrence Stroll to make way for the billionaire's son Lance to have a seat, but proved the doubters wrong in 2021 when he started from P8 and won a shock victory in the Hungarian Grand Prix. Today, Ocon frequently credits his parents and all the people that helped him to reach the top in his interviews, saying how grateful he is that he was able to make it to the top and that he could not have done it alone. He now employs his father, who continues to be his mechanic. Pell kicked a grapefruit or a sock stuffed with newspaper around due to lacking in actual football and was a servant in tea shops. He lived in poverty in Brazil's São Paulo state. An amateur coach named Waldemar de Brito recognized his talent and told the professional club Santos FC that he would be the best player in the world someday. On his senior debut at age 15, he scored in a 7-1 victory. With Brazil, he was the only player in history to win the World Cup 3 times. His philanthropic work included raising over 4 2 for charity and fought to better the education system for underprivileged Brazilian children. He was diagnosed with colon cancer in 2021 and died in late December 2022, aged 82. He and Diego Maradona shared the Player of the 20th Century Award. Story 106. Jesus is a good subject, however. He never became rich, just rich in life and happiness, and getting strong to the cross. So the question is pointed at choosing a subject that went from rags to riches, and the only one I know about is Mr. Musk. He said he had a terrible childhood and it didn't stop him, and he never gave up, and he created a kingdom of magic inventions. Story 107. The creator of Dark Souls started at the bottom of the game dev company and is now the president of said gaming company, practically unheard of in Japanese working culture. Story 108. If you go back to the 19th century, I would say Charles Dickens. His tales are often about poor people and the issues that afflict them, debtor's jail, etc., because he grew up poor and had to go to work as a child in such a prison. Later went on to become, and still remain, one of the most read authors internationally to this day, among the top 5, I believe, including the Bible, Shakespeare, Agatha Christie. Story 109. Sam Walton grew up in poor South, worked in sales until he founded First Storefront, which became the first of many stores we now know as Walmart. His kids are all billionaires. Story 110. You have thousands of these examples in sports like football, baseball, and basketball. What kind of story are you looking for? Story 111. Bovaline McGraw, born into abject poverty, had a deadbeat dad and an alcoholic mother. Both died during her childhood. By 37, she was working as a dishwasher and still living in abject poverty. Then a very wealthy distant relative, of whom she was unaware, died and she inherited a few $1,000,000. She lived a humble life with the inheritance until her passing at 45. Story 112. Adolf Hitler. His career didn't end well for him and millions of other people, but motherfucker was dedicated and wildly successful for a long time. Stalin should also be mentioned here. Story 113. Elon Musk came from one of the poorest parts of South Africa, where white men had dislike crimes committed on them daily, managed to escape and create a system millions still use totally by himself, and then went into EV car manufacturing. On top of all that, this African man then went on and helped elect an amazing president of his adopted country. We are lucky to have him. Story 114. There is a guy in my country that got around lotto laws by calling what he was doing trade promotions in the car industry, and his net worth is now 1 through B. Story 115. Bill Clinton, aka the first black president. Say what you want about him. He started out poor white trash in Arkansas and got an education and served 8 years as president. Story 116. Certainly didn't start as low as most of these other candidates, but Keith Gill gets my vote. Turned 50 grand into 1B in 4 years with minimal effort and massive fudge balls. And his story isn't even finished. Story 117. The Austrian painter, homeless on the streets of Vienna to ruling Germany. This fact impressed the hell out Winston Churchill. Story 118. Well, me, I was adopted by violent psychopaths, almost got takedown by them a few times, was thrown into the streets and slept in the snow more than once, worked my jerk off to get money. A few years later, vacationing in Europe. A few years after that, bought my first house. Every time I hear some whine and cry about how hard it is and they just, can't I almost blow a gasket? If I can, you can. No excuses. Story 119. Girl that was jumping from one shitty job to another. Did win not a massive amount, but enough to be able to study 2 to 3 years without having to work. Was able to land a good job and nice paycheck thanks to her studies. So basically changed her life for better. Story 120. A guy I went to high school with won the lottery in his early 30s. He bought the low-income housing block he grew up in and his mother still lived in, completely renovated it, and kept it low-income housing. I don't know what else he did with the money, but he changed a lot of families' lives for the better with that one purchase. Story 121. A guy I went to high school with won the lottery in his early 30s. He bought the low-income housing block he grew up in and his mother still lived in, completely renovated it, and kept it low-income housing. I don't know what else he did with the money, but he changed a lot of families' lives for the better with that one purchase. Answer: I love that so much. That's also what I fantasize about doing. I won't have children, and I grew up solidly middle class, but with great financial stability from my parents, which allowed me to explore so many things. I would love to provide that stability for someone else, or ideally a lot of someone's. My parents believe very strongly in improving your small corner of the world. My dad worked full-time, and my mom volunteered full-time once we were in school between several PTOs, a 311 suicide hotline in my area, and a few other worthy causes. They support a few families in our extended family who have profoundly disabled children. They've rescued several women from DV situations and set them up in much better lives. They've taken in 6 or so young adults and helped them dramatically improve their lives. I hope I can live up to their legacy. Story 122. I worked with a lady who was 2 cubicles down from me. She would buy the lottery religiously, and one Friday our boss said to her, "I laugh, you win the $55 million and come in on Monday and quit." Well, she sure did. She was the first solo winner in my city, and she quit Monday morning. She and her husband didn't change much. They just remodeled their home and continue to live simple lives. Both are retired. She was 42 when she won. This was about 10 years ago now. Story 123 won $2 million and paid off their debt, plus made a few large purchases. Friends, relatives, churches, and charities found out and asked for loans and handouts. Eventually, the money ran out, and they ended up stealing a bit from some organization they were the treasurer of because they wanted to chase that high again. I can't remember if they did jail time or just did community service, but they had to sell some things and ended up only slightly better off than they were before winning the lottery. Story 124. I worked in retail with a woman who won just over $1 million in the U.S. in 1,998. She got laid off from her job as a checker the very next day. The HR lady said she had never seen someone so happy being laid off, and this was about 20 days before Christmas. She became a stay-at-home mom, and her husband, who was working at 7 to 11 and absolutely loved to talk to people, took his dream job, selling cars. I saw him about 8 years age, and he said they still lived in the same house, and he was still selling cars for the same dealership. Story 125. I worked in retail with a woman who won just over $1 million in the U.S. in 1,998. She got laid off from her job as a checker the very next day. The HR lady said she had never seen someone so happy being laid off. And this was about 20 days before Christmas. She became a stay-at-home mom, and her husband, who was working at 7 to 11 and absolutely loved to talk to people, took his dream job, selling cars. I saw him about 8 years of age, and he said they still lived in the same house, and he was still selling cars for the same dealership. Story 126. My friend's aunt and uncle won cash for life. Less than a year after winning, their house was hit by a tornado. They rebuilt, much larger than the original build. They didn't change, but their home did. Last were cash for life if the one I would want. Not enough money to drastically change your life, but an extra $4,000 a month tax-free if you take the payment that way would mean you would likely have zero financial worry in your life if you kept working. If I ever wanted, I wouldn't stop working completely, but I could just have some social menial job to keep me happy and travel as much as I want. Story 127. A friend's mom won in like 1,989. This was before you could take the lump sum. After taxes, her payout was 37, got zero wire for 25 years. She quit her job thinking she'd be rich, but didn't realize she was making less than her job paid and ended up going back to work a few years later because of insurance, etc. Story 128. Co-worker won $250K on a scratch it. He ended up with $170K. He bought a house and a used car, then took his kids to Disneyland. Then the story gets weird. He wanted to move to a different state, so he sold his house and moved into a value inn in that new state. Then he proceeded to never find a house, spent all the money living in a garbage hotel. He had some pretty big problems that just seemed to get worse. Eventually, his mother passed away, so he moved back to his home state to live in his mother's old house. Poor bastard. Story 129. My friend's aunt won about $800K, which can be a generational change sum if managed correctly. She gave her immediate family $1K each, about 15 persons, paid her and her husband student loans in full, all of her debt and house mortgage, and decided to invest the rest. She still works at a school as a head teacher, and my friend tells me that her mentality is something like, what easy comes, easy goes, so she doesn't spend the money lavishly. Story 130. My parents won the Reader's Digest sweepstakes. Yes, people really win those. No, they didn't have to buy anything. It paid out $5 million over 30 years, or roughly $170K per year. So not buy a private island money, but more than my parents had ever seen. They retired early, bought a modest house in their hometown near their family, and started doing the things they'd always wanted to do. They traveled the world, ate at good restaurants, drank nice wine. When grandkids came along, they could afford to visit 4 or 5 times a year. The money was an unqualified blessing for them, and I'm so happy they got to enjoy it. Story 131. The town I used to live in has a lottery every year where they give away a house. This guy won it in 1,996, who would become the neighbor of the place I was renting a few years ago. At this time, the house was worth about $400K. This guy was old and in poor health. He was married, but his wife was wealthy and had her own entire house in a nicer area of town. When his health got so bad that he couldn't live alone, he gifted lottery prize house to my landlord, who was his neighbor. He also gifted my landlord the entire contents of the fully furnished house. He just didn't have the energy to deal with selling everything, so he said, if you can deal with it, it's yours. Me and the landlord went through the house for fun, opening boxes and checking it out. Of interest, we found 5 rifles hidden behind a false wall, some gold jewelry, a machete, an 80s police scanner, nice home gym equipment, gold panning gear, and more. I got to keep the machete and some gold. Turns out his wife didn't want him home alone with those guns, so she had been pushing for him to get out of there and leave it all behind. I don't know if he's still alive or what, but my former landlord is a lucky guy. Story 132. Well, the biggest Powerball winner in Australia, over 100 million, just kept going to her nursing job because she said she likes nursing. Not surprisingly, she made use of the option to remain anonymous. Apart from saying she bought new place to move into, no plans to do anything particularly flashy, and especially not financially irresponsible. Jackpot next Thursday has hit 150 million for the first time. Going by past history, it'll likely go to 1 to 4 winning tickets. Story 133. We had a lady who ran our repair shop hit a decent jackpot on slots. She was already retired from her government job but wanted to stay busy. Her and her partner would hit the casino every weekend and had enough time and money invested in gambling that they were comped all their room and food by the casino. Well, one Monday morning, she called a few of us into her office and told us she was now retiring a second time because she hit a nice fatass payout on nickel slots, 440. One crazy additional tidbit is that there is a lot of paperwork, verification, and taxes associated with a big payout, I guess. So her and her partner did what anyone would do while waiting in a casino. They played more slots. During that time, they hit almost another $15 zero and about 3 jackpots on slots. Never heard from or saw her again? Thank you for watching the video all the way to the end. If you'd like to see more content like this, you might be interested to know that I've created another channel with a similar theme, especially for those of you who enjoy what I do. I'll leave a link in the description, and I hope to see you there. Take care.